my name is Tiffany and welcome back to my channel. Before we get started on today's video, I wanted to show you all what just came in the mail. My channel has over 100,000 subscribers, which is insane, and I'm honestly in disbelief, and I just wanted to say the biggest thank you from the bottom of my heart. I was honestly not prepared for this, but I'm already coming up with ideas to make a special 100K outfit. But for today's video, I'm back with another Upcycle by Little Toe where I take old forgotten items and give them a new life. If you like sewing and upcycling content, make sure you give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. I celebrated Lunar New Year this past week and I wanted to make something special to celebrate, so I turned this thrifted tablecloth into my modern take on a cheongsam, so let's get started. I thrifted this tablecloth for $1.99. It has a ruffled hem, so at first I thought it was a bed skirt, but it is so long, so I'm pretty sure this is a tablecloth. It is 50% cotton and 50% polyester, and here is a better look at the ruffled hem. I'm going to be using this pattern that I bought a few months ago, but I'm only going to be using it as a starting point, and for reference, I'm using the size 10 pattern as a guide. There is a really specific method of tailoring a traditional cheongsam, and full disclaimer, this video is not that. This is just a design that I came up with, and I'm constructing my version in a way that makes the most sense to me. I want to keep some traditional elements of a cheongsam like the mandarin collar, but I'm also going to be making some modifications to give my version a little bit more of a modern feel. Here are the pieces that will make up the front bodice. This larger piece will overlap the smaller piece, creating the diagonal opening at the chest area, which is very typical of most cheongsams. I wanted to quickly mention that this pattern only has facing pieces for the bodice, but I want my version to be fully lined, so I'm going to go ahead and cut out lining pieces as well. Starting with the smaller piece, I went ahead and cut out an identical piece for my lining. Now I'm placing them right side spacing and I'll sew along the center front here as well as along this curve. Now that these pieces are sewn together, I'm carefully clipping this corner here and then making several notches along this curve so that everything lays nice and flat when I turn it to the right side. I'm going to go ahead and give this a good press, and this is what it should look like now. Moving on to the larger front bodice piece. I've already marked the darts and now I'm going to go ahead and sew them, and you should have something that looks like this. This is the center front point, and I'm going to make marks every 1 3/4 of an inch apart along this curve here. I mark 6 points, and this will be the placement of my buttonhole loops. I'm using elastic string to form a little loop that I'll hand sew to each mark that I previously made. So traditionally, a cheongsam would use frog closures for that chest opening, and I'm going to include some pictures to show you what that looks like, but since I'm going for a more modern feel, I've decided to use buttons instead. Here is a close-up, and you can see that each loop is secured by 2 sets of stitching. The stitching on the left is just temporary to help keep the loops together when I sew this to the lining, and I'll remove them later. Next step is to sew the lining. I've already sewn the darts and I'm placing these pieces right side spacing. Now I'll sew together starting from this center front point along this curve to the side seam. I've gone ahead and turned it to the right side and pressed the seam nice and flat. I've also gone ahead and removed the basting stitch on the loops from earlier, and this is what it should look like now. As you can see here, this part is not yet attached, and I also made notches in the seam allowance along this curve here just like before. This is the original pattern for the back bodice. I want mine to have an open back, so I'm going to freehand an arch here, and this is what it should look like with a cutout in the center back. I've cut out my lining, which I'm placing right side spacing, and I'll sew together along this arch. Here it is pressed and turned to the right side, and once again I made notches in the seam allowance to help this lay flat. Next, I'm going to sew a straight stitch about 1/2 inch from the edge here, creating a channel. I've sewn my channel and we'll get to this a little later, but for now I'm placing my smaller front bodice piece right side spacing and pinning just the shell layers, and I'll sew them together along the shoulder seams. I'm going to repeat this with the larger front bodice piece, again only pinning and sewing the shell layers along the shoulder seams. Here's what it looks like with just the shells sewn together, and I'll do the same for the lining by matching up the shoulder seams, making sure that the lining pieces are right side spacing and then pinning in place. The other side is a little trickier, but I'm maneuvering the garment around until I can match the right sides of the other shoulder seam and then pinning in place. I'll sew the lining pieces together, and this is what it should look like at this point with the front and back pieces sewn together at the shoulder seams, and you can see here that on the inside of the garment, the seam allowance of the lining is hidden in between both layers as well. Next up is the mandarin collar, which I've cut out following the pattern. The top piece is the lining and this bottom piece is the shell, and I've gone ahead and ironed on interfacing to just this piece to give it a little bit of structure. I'm placing these pieces right side spacing and sewing together from this point along the top to this point. Here is the collar turned to the right side and pressed. Next, I'll pin the collar to the top in between the shell and lining of the neckline. The collar is sandwiched along the neckline between the shell and lining, which are right side spacing. And because of the curve in the neckline, I've used a ton of pins to ensure that nothing shifts when I sew this together. I've gone ahead and sewn the collar in place, and you can see here that the shell and lining are right side spacing with the collar secured in between them. I didn't film this, but I also went ahead and made notches along the entire seam allowance of the neckline just like I did earlier, and when I turn the bodice over to the right side, you'll see that the seam allowance of the neckline is neatly hidden between the shell and the lining. Moving on. Now I'm inserting this elastic into the channel that I made earlier. The reason I'm adding elastic to the back is because I've cut my back bodice piece with no darts, which means that it's not going to lay properly along the curve of my back, and there's probably going to be some gaping issues, so this elastic is just going to help cinch the back a little bit and hopefully fix any sort of gaping issues. I've secured the elastic in place by sewing it to the opening of the channel on both sides. Next, I'm attaching a waistband to just the back, and I've cut out 2 long strips that are 2 1/4 inches tall, and I used the waist width of my back skirt piece to figure out the length that I needed. Starting with the first waistband piece, I'm placing it right side spacing about an inch above the hem of the top, and I'll sew a straight stitch here so that when I fold this down later, the edges of the waistband will line up with the hem of the top. I'm pinning this in place, and I'll sew from this side seam to this green pin, and most importantly, I've only pinned it to the shell and not the lining. I've sewn that together and repeated the same steps for the other side. Here is a better look, and again I've sewn them together from the side seams to just these points, and this waistband piece is only attached to the shell. Now I'll repeat these steps with the second waistband piece, sewing it to just the lining. Here's what it looks like sewn on, and the shell and lining are still separate. Next, I'll sew along here, sewing the rest of the waistband together. If anyone knows an easier way of doing this, please let me know in the comments below. This is just what made sense to me, but I'm always willing to learn. The waistband is sewn on and pressed, and this is what it should look like at this point. Next is to attach the skirt. Here is the back skirt shell. I did not sew the darts because I'll be adding elastic to the back later. I'm placing the skirt piece right side spacing onto the waistband. Then I pin it to just the shell waistband layer and then sew together. Now that that's sewn on, I'm going to sew the lining waistband to the back skirt lining. I repeat these steps, pinning the back skirt lining right side spacing to just the waistband lining and then sew together. Here's what it should look like now with the lining pieces sewn together and the shell pieces sewn together. Moving on to the front. Here is my front skirt shell, and I've already gone ahead and sewn the darts. I'm placing it right side spacing to the bodice and pinning the shell layers together, making sure that my darts are lined up. I'll sew this together and repeat this for the front lining, and this is what the dress should look like at this point, with the front bodice and skirt shell sewn together and the lining sewn together as well. Next step is to sew the invisible zipper to just the front shell here. Here is one side of the zipper tape sewn onto the front shell, and now I'm flipping the shell over so that the zipper tape is sandwiched between the front shell and lining. You can see here that the right sides of the shell and lining are touching with the zipper tape in between them. Now I'll go ahead and sew the lining to the zipper along here. You'll see here that this side of the zipper tape is neatly sewn between the shell and lining with the seam allowance hidden, and I'll repeat these steps for the other side. You can see here that the top of the zipper stops at this point of the side seam, and to finish the remaining top section, I've gone ahead and sewn the side seam of the smaller front bodice to the side seam of the back bodice, making sure to sandwich the front piece in between the shell and lining layers of the back piece, hiding the seam allowance for a clean finish. Just like the other side, the rest of the zipper tape is sandwiched between the shell and lining. Next is to sew this side seam together, and again I'll sew shell to shell and lining to lining. This is what it should look like with the side seams sewed together, and you can see here that the lining is a little bit longer than the shell because I'll be adding a ruffle hem to the shell a little later. Here is a quick look at the inside, and you can see here that the raw edges are all neatly hidden. I mentioned earlier that I will be elasticizing the waist in the back, so I'm going to sew a straight stitch from here to here, creating a channel for my elastic. Now that the channel is sewn, I'm using 1 inch wide elastic, and I've attached safety pins to both ends of the elastic. I'm feeding the elastic in between the shell and lining layers and then through the channel and pin this end of the elastic in place. Then I adjust the other end of the elastic, creating these gathers in the waistband, and pin the other end in place. Next, I'll top stitch here, securing the elastic in between the waistband layers. I also decided to sew straight stitches along the top, center, and bottom of the elastic to keep it from twisting inside of the channel. Next up is the sleeves, and here are the 2 pieces I cut out for each sleeve. I'm going to start by placing them right side spacing and sewing from this point to this point, leaving an opening at the bottom. I also didn't want any raw edges to be visible, so I folded the seam allowance under and top stitch it down, and I just love how clean this looks. I repeated this with the sleeve seam as well. I've gone ahead and sewn a basting stitch around the bottom of the sleeve, and now I'm pulling on the loose end, creating these gathers. To finish the sleeve, I cut out this long strip of fabric that is 30 inches by 1 1/4 inch, and I'm going to fold and press the raw edges towards the center and use this as a bias tape to cover the raw edges of the bottom of the sleeve. This is what it should look like sewn on with the raw edge encased between the long strip. To finish the sleeve, I'll tie these 2 loose ends into a bow, and I'll also sew a basting stitch along the top of the sleeve, creating gathers. I've gone ahead and pinned the sleeve to the bodice, and here are the gathers on the top section of the sleeve. You can see here that I've only pinned the sleeve to the shell and not the lining, and I'll sew those together with my machine. I'm gonna go ahead and hand sew the lining to the sleeve, making sure that I tuck in all of the raw edges. And if you don't wanna do this, you can just go ahead and sew the sleeve to both the shell and lining pieces and then overlock the raw edges. But I'm choosing to do this because I wanna make sure that the finish on the inside is super clean as well. Now that one sleeve is sewn on, I'm going to repeat this for the other side, and this cheongsam is almost done. Next, I'm going to hem the lining by folding up twice and sewing, and then adding the ruffle hem to the shell. I'm going to be reusing the ruffled hem of the tablecloth for the ruffled hem of my dress because it's already the perfect height, so now all I'm gonna do is measure out the length that I need, and then I'll gather that and pin that to the dress. Here is what the ruffled hem looks like sewn on, and last step is to sew on the buttons to each corresponding buttonhole loop from earlier. I'm going to be using these pearl buttons that I saved from a previous upcycle, and I think they're gonna look so lovely against that floral fabric. To find the placement of the buttons, I've put on the cheongsam and pinned it in place. Then, using the buttonhole loops as a guide, I used a fabric marker to mark where the buttons needed to be. I went ahead and hand sewed the buttons onto the dress, and here is a close-up of what they look like sewn on. I know that it is so much extra work to fully line a dress instead of using facing or just overlocking to hide all of the raw edges, but it is so satisfying to me when the inside of the garment looks just as nice and neat as the outside of the garment. This is what my cheongsam looks like on. This is my first attempt at making one, so I am so happy with how this turned out. I think the cutout detail in the back is a really nice contrast to the high neckline. I'm so glad I went with these buttons because I think the pearl adds a really beautiful and dainty touch, but one of my favorite parts of this cheongsam is the details of the delicate puffy sleeve. And not to worry, of course I made Daisy her own little version as well. I hope you all enjoyed this video. I love celebrating and sharing my culture and heritage with you, so I hope you liked my modern take on a cheongsam. If you want to see more photos, make sure you follow me on Instagram at Little Toe. If you liked this video, give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel, and let me know in the comments below what you thought about this upcycle. Wishing you a very happy and prosperous Year of the Tiger, and as always, thank you so much for watching.